Pioneering research in marketing is showing that consumers would much prefer less inequality in our world. Our keynote speaker of the day is Michael Norton, Harold M. Brearley Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. I must tell you, will still have 15 minutes after the presentation, 15 minutes for the Q&A. If you want to participate, you must submit your question at the events platform in order to be answered by Professor Norton, who now I am calling live. Hello, Mr. Norton.
Thank you all for having me at this event. I feel like there's a delay. I hope people can hear me. So I wanted to say that I came into marketing. I'm a psychologist by training, and I came into marketing about 20 years ago. And in that time, there's been a huge shift in the focus within marketing, not because of me, but the focus within marketing on issues of social justice and issues of inequality. And so that's been a very welcome change. We see it in industry as well. And so my hope is that, I'm not sure who's leading who, but that we both continue to lead each other to cope with these very important issues. So I wanted to talk today about some research we've been doing for quite a few years on inequality. Inequality is, of course, so salient in the world today. We see the consequences of it in domain after domain, and we're always trying to think in our research a couple of things, really thinking about what is the right level of inequality. And that's a very complex question for lots of different reasons, because you have to think about what facets go into it and who you're thinking about and what's fair and what's unfair. But one of the ways that we started this was with a very simple thought experiment, which was just asking people, if it were up to you, like if we gave you a desert island with a bunch of people, how would you construct the society? So what would you think about as you did it? Who gets what? What resources come to mind? Should everybody have the exact same? Should other people have more and other people have less? If yes, how much more and how much less, and what are the consequences of that? So we're not able to give people a desert island and have them start a society, but that really is the underlying idea, which is if it really were up to you or up to us, if we could start over, how would we want things to be distributed amongst all of us? And if the answer is the way they are now, that would be interesting as well. But we had a feeling, and I'll show you in a bunch of the projects, that that's not actually what ends up happening in the research, that very often there are mismatches between what we believe we'd like to have and the way things really are. And so the motivating approach is hopefully very, very simple, which is just, we ask people, what do you think your society is like right now? And I'll show you, we can ask about wealth or income or healthcare, whatever it might be. And then we also ask them, what do you want your society to look like? This is the desert island. If it were up to you, what would you like things to look like on this dimension? And then we just compare those two numbers to what their society actually looks like. So again, you could imagine that the answers to all three of those are exactly the same. People say, I think my society looks like this. I want it to look like that. And then when we check the data, it already looks like that. That would be a very nice world where we had somehow perfectly allocated resources in the way that people think is best. Again, as I'll show you, we don't always see that that's exactly the case. The third thing that we try to do is we try to see really if people agree or disagree. So you can imagine that when we ask people, what would you like your society to look like? People on the left say something extremely different from people on the right, or different ethnicities, or different genders, or different socioeconomic classes, that people really, really disagree about what things should look like. That would be interesting as well to us. What we were hoping to see is that even across all of those differences, there's something in people that they hold in common. That if we ask very, very different people what they think things should look like, even though they disagree about all kinds of things, that there might be some consensus within all of those differences. And then the final thing that we do is, once we've done those sorts of things where we find out how people think things should be, and then we compare it to how things actually are, is then we look to see, well, what if we feed that back to people? So what if we tell them now, I don't know if you knew this, but you want things to look like this, and in fact, they look like that. What do you want to do about it? And one of the domains that we take that approach is, of course, within the marketing domain, where we start to tell people about different aspects of companies and inequality within companies to see how that then affects consumer behavior. So I'll talk about a few different domains to walk you through the general approach, and then also talk about the work that we do in the marketing domain in particular. The very first domain that we started with was with wealth. So we knew, or we had a very strong feeling, let's say, that wealth was extremely unevenly distributed everywhere. This particular study was done in the United States. I'll show some global data in a few minutes. And again, the idea is so simple. We just ask people these questions, right? What do you think it looks like? What do you want it to look like? And then we can compare it to what it actually looks like. And it really just looks like this. And you can do it for yourself for Portugal or for any country, wherever you're watching from. Ask yourself, this is the just do you know what's going on? So what percent does the richest 20% own, all the way down to the poorest 20%? We've done these surveys with all sorts of people all over the world. In general, people, their answers sum to 100, which is good. And if they don't, we make them do it again. But just ask yourself, what do you think Portugal looks like? What do you think the United States looks like right now? Here's what our respondents told us in one of the first studies we ran with a few thousand Americans. So just to orient you, this is their estimate. So when we said, what does America look like right now? What they told us was that they believe that the top 20% have about 60% of the wealth. And you can see that combined, the bottom 40% have something like 10% of the wealth. So people's estimates of inequality, they're very aware that things are unequal. And by the way, by unequal, I don't even mean morally or ethically. I just mean right now, mathematically, that is mathematically a very unequal distribution of resources. So that's what they think things look like. But we also ask those same people, what would you like it to look like? This is the desert island idea. If it were up to you, how would you like things to look? And this, we don't put the word should in gigantic red letters when we do the survey, but just to highlight it, now we're asking a very similar question, but what should they own? Or what do you think is fair, we ask in other surveys. And again, you can answer these questions. And what we find here, again, we could find that what they think it should be is exactly the same as their estimates, but of course, that's not what we see at all. So you can see that the ideal distribution is much more equal than the estimated distribution. However, I want to point out that the ideal distribution is not equal. So we very rarely see people actually who want everyone to have the exact same amount. Sometimes when I give this talk, people say, so you're saying everyone's a socialist and they want everyone to have the same thing. And I say, some people want that, but most people, in fact, the vast majority of people don't want perfect equality. They just want less inequality than they think there is. And in particular, what people typically do, and you can see by the size of the bars, is they sort of take from the rich and then they redistribute it to the very poorest respondents. So the relative change in purple, for example, is quite large, and the relative change in the dark blue for the top 20% is also quite large. Okay, so now we have the very same people are telling us this is what we think the United States looks like, and this is what we would like it to look like if it were up to us. But luckily, what we can also do is get the reality of what the United States actually looks like. And this is the real data at roughly the time that we ran the survey. What you can see is, again, an extremely unequal distribution. So wealth can be very hard to measure. So the numbers bounce around a little bit. But it does seem that, in general, the top 20% have something like 80 to 85% of the wealth. And the bottom 40% typically have none. So you can see that the light blue and purple do not even appear on the top line, and that's because they actually have typically no net wealth as a group. When we published this paper, the people who do the copy editing sent an email to us and said there's an error in the figure because you left out the purple bar and the light blue bar on the top line, and of course we had to say that's not an error. Unfortunately, it turns out that the bottom 40% have nothing. So you can see just how different these are from each other. So you have at the actual 85% of the wealth is owned by the top 20%. And in the ideal 30%, something like that is owned by the top 20%. That's like a shift. 50% of all wealth people believe should be somewhere else. That's the first finding that we saw. That's kind of the first thing that we try to do, is really see Do people know what it looks like? What do they want it to look like? And how do those things match up to reality? But as I said, the other thing that we always try to do is see if people agree or disagree on these ideals. If they disagree, it's interesting. If they agree, it lets us say things like Americans would like more or less inequality, rather than people on the left, people on the right, rich people, poor people. So the way that we do this is we just really break this data down by a bunch of different demographics. I'll just show you some for illustration purposes. So you can see we have people with less than 50,000, between 50 and 100,000, over 100,000. At the time of this survey, these were relevant people in the world. George W. Bush and John Kerry at the time were the presidential candidates. And we also break it down by women and men because people, for some reason, always find that extremely interesting. So this is the estimates. So what you can see is that everyone is wrong. No one is close to getting the answer right. And it's not really predicted by most things. It's just people are off in terms of what they think. The more interesting one, though, is the ideals. This is where we might see differences really start to emerge. But what's so interesting for us is we don't really. So you can see in these data, for example, people who make over $100,000 want more inequality. They want the top 20% to have more than people who make less than $50,000, which is exactly what we would expect. We might think that richer people want rich people to have more than poor people think. That's perfectly sensible. But what's so critical is if you look at the lines on the bottom on the ideals compared to the estimates, there's no group where the ideal is even close to what they think it is. And that means it's even further from what it actually is. So we do see, despite the differences of opinion at the bottom, there's a general sense that people would like things to be more equal than they think they are, which is already more equal than things actually are. Just for the sake of making fun of myself. So we also, for some reason, the Alumni Association allowed us to survey Harvard alumni on these questions. You can sometimes people say, well, maybe these, respondents are not educated about the economy or something like that. So we said, let's get a group of supposedly smart people and have them do the survey. You can see that their estimates are still off, and their, again, ideals are more equal than their estimates, which are more equal than their actual reality. We also broke this down by which part of Harvard. And I just wanted to highlight that the group on the very left here, the desired or ideal distribution, the group that we've found, actually, this is the most unequal any group has ever wanted things to be, are graduates of the Harvard Business School, which is, of course, where I teach. So we possibly have some work to do there. But again, you see across all of these groups, the ideals are much, much more equal than what people estimate things to be. Okay, so we started with wealth because we thought, first off, we knew there'd be inequality. So we kind of knew things would work in a sense that people wouldn't really know what was going on. And we could maybe try to show some differences in opinion from what people wanted compared to what things actually looked like. But wealth is a really hard metric. It's extremely hard to know other people's wealth because it's hidden. So we might own the exact same size apartment, but I own mine outright and you're $1 million in debt on yours. We look like we have the same wealth, but underneath we have very different wealth. So instead of using wealth now, we switch to income, which is a little bit easier to figure out in the world. We can get a little more information about what other people's income is. And the idea is on this metric too, now are people accurate? And now do people's ideals match what they think things are like? Or again, do we see similar dynamics where people's estimates and ideals aren't aligned with how things actually work? And as I mentioned, we look at this in a survey of about 40 countries in the world. We always try to ask very, very simple questions. So you are asked, if you took this survey, how much do you think the chairman of a large national corporation earns? You enter it in your own currency. Of course, chairman of a large national corporation is meant to be across countries, the person who makes the most. And unskilled worker in a factory, again, is meant to be across countries, the person who makes the least. So we have these two numbers here. And of course, what we can do is create a ratio, just saying what is their estimate of the CEO pay to their estimate of the unskilled worker pay. This also allows us to take out differences in currency and things like that, because we're just converting to a ratio so we can compare countries more easily. Okay, that's again the estimated. What do you think things look like? Here's all the countries. Luckily, it's very sad if your country is not on the wheel because you want to see your own country. Luckily, Portugal is in this data set. So these are the estimates of what these ratios look like. So you can see that there's pretty wide variability. The idea of this figure is, so if you look in the outer circle is 41. That means if there's a data point there, it means people think CEOs make 41 times as much as unskilled workers. The closer you get to the middle, the more they think CEOs and unskilled workers make the exact same amount. So everywhere people are aware that CEOs, of course, make more than unskilled workers, but we see some variation here. Across all countries, it varies a bit from study to study, but it seems to be something like 10 to 12-ish to 1 is the ratio that people estimate, which is incredibly low. So in the US, for example, that means it's something like people think unskilled workers make 20,000 and CEOs make 200,000. Why is the 200,000 number so low? Typically, people have very little access to extremely wealthy people. So this is sort of what they think the average leader of a company makes and the average unskilled worker. 10 to 1, something like that. Okay, those are the estimates. As always, we want to do the ideals as well. So now, again, we ask what should, we don't put the should in big red letters, but what should these two groups earn? We create another ratio, and now we can plot their ideal ratio against their estimated ratio. So you've seen this before. Now I'll put on the ideal ratios on this. And what you can see is, again, there's wide variability in what people think the ratio should be. But just visually, you can see that there's not a single country where people's ideals are even close to what they think things are actually like. Mirroring a little bit the wealth data, again, here we tend to see that people want things to be more equal than they think they are. This ratio is typically something like 5 or 6 to 1 is the ideal, which again is a very compressed income distribution, but not everyone should make the same amount of money. So everyone still thinks CEOs should make more than unskilled workers. They just think that the ratio should be a bit tighter. So if their estimates in the US, for example, were $20,000 and $200,000, basically what they say is something like $30,000 and $150,000. They take a bit from the rich and they give a bit to the poor and make things a little bit more equal, but still leaving a huge amount of space between those two groups. Across all of these countries, we see this consensus again. There aren't countries where people's ideals are, for example, more equal than their estimates. We don't see that in the data. And within each of these countries, again, we can look at things like political affiliation, left versus right, however we categorize these things from country to country. And again, yes, we see differences, but the ideals for every group, again, are still more equal than what they think things actually are. And of course, the kicker for this whole project is we can again compare these to the actual. So reality is a little bit different than those numbers I just showed you. So for the actual income gap between CEOs and unskilled workers, some of the data is very hard to get. So in some countries, you just can't access any estimate of how much CEOs versus unskilled workers make. And it's difficult in general to calculate CEO compensation because we know, some CEOs take $1 of salary, but their stock options are worth billions of dollars. So it's actually quite difficult to calculate their compensation. But for these countries, we got some of the data. My colleague Sorapop Kiatpongsan, who led this project, really tracked down all of this data from these countries. You already see the punchline that's coming up, which is if you look at the outer rim of this particular one, it says 351. Remember that the previous one ended at 41 to 1. Now this one we have to go up to 351 to 1. And the reason for that is that there's, of course, big pay gaps between CEOs and unskilled workers. My country is the worst. It's possible it's because global corporations have headquarters here. It's possible that there's something else going on, but no country, of course, is close to having, equal pay ratios for sure. But what we want to do really is compare the actual to people's estimates and to their ideals. And what you see is, remember the big red thing that was really a big splotch before? These are their estimates of the ratios, and then these are their ideals of the ratios. So dramatically different. Now, there's no way that people could know the actual distribution of this stuff. It's hard to get the data. So the difference between the red and the gray is interesting to me, but of course people aren't going to know that exactly right. What I think is a fair comparison, though, is the difference again between the red and the blue, because that's the same person using the same information telling us that they would like things to be more equal than they actually are. Okay, so that was the income aspect as well. Once we started doing this, we kept finding in domain after domain that we saw this pattern again and again, that people did not know exactly what their society looked like, that people wanted it to be more equal than that, and typically things were actually more unequal than either of those numbers. And I'll show you another domain in a few minutes. But at some point, of course, we got a little bit tired of just showing this pattern over and over again, and the question was, what should we do with this information? You know, is there things that we can do to change the way people think now that we know this? So my colleague Bhavya Mohan had this idea to study these issues within companies within a marketing context, in part because in the DoddFrank Act, in the previous financial crisis, global crisis, the US Congress passed the DoddFrank Act and had this little clause within it that it required companies to disclose the median of the total compensation, the median of employees, the median of the chief executive officer, and the ratio of those two. No one's quite sure who slipped this thing in. Afterward, companies were very upset and delayed it for over a decade, having to disclose this information, in part because they said it would be too costly to determine, even though, of course, it's almost very easy to determine because you know what you're paying your employees and you know what you're paying the CEO. Clearly, they had a feeling maybe this isn't going to make us look so good. Bhavya's idea was to take this from, you know, companies have to disclose this in their annual filings to the SEC, and nobody ever sees this information. Her idea was, what if we show this information directly to consumers? Would consumers start to react very differently if they saw that companies were paying their employees or paying their CEOs quite differently? And the analogy that she had in mind, which I loved, was in these energy efficiency stickers that are on products now all over the world, but they started to appear probably 20 years ago. And the idea is that they give you very quick information about different aspects of the product that you're buying, like a refrigerator or an air conditioning unit. And you can see sort of the energy costs, but also the yearly electricity use. So for example, you might see one refrigerator with this and one refrigerator with this, and you're sort of trading off the cost of it and the efficiency of it. And at some point you try to figure out, I guess I'll go with that refrigerator, which sort of gets me at the right amount of savings, but I still am doing something good for the environment. That's the trade-off that people are making. And Bhavya's idea was to do just that, but to do it with pay instead. So imagine, we haven't gotten any company to agree to do this, by the way, but imagine that when you were buying a product, there was also a sticker on it that had this information: the pay of the average employee and the pay of the CEO, and then the ratio of CEO pay to employee pay. This is a real retailer in the US. They actually have a ratio of 1,000 to 1. We can compare that to their perceptions of retailers like this. This is also another large retailer in the US that has a philosophy of paying, philosophy of keeping the ratio much, much lower. So again, you can think when employees are deciding to decide between things and they're looking at this towel made by, you know, a company with this ratio, or this towel made by a company with this ratio, in one sense, they should say, I don't care at all. All I should look at is the price, because what companies pay their employees isn't really any of my business. But we had a feeling, given what we had seen in the previous research, that people might care quite a bit about that. And in fact, that is what we see. So controlling for everything else about products, people are willing to pay more for a company that has a lower CEO to worker ratio than these higher ratios. Are they willing to pay 10 times as much? Of course not. At some point, there's limits on all of our preferences. But we do show that even when people have to put cash on the line, they still will pay more from these kinds of retailers with more equal ratios. We looked here in one of these studies, we ran it in the US, and we looked here to see, again, consensus and difference. So in this case, we can look again at things like income and political affiliation. And what we find is that in the US, if we sort of loosely group people into left, center, and right, people on the left and in the center have a strong preference for retailers with lower ratios. People on the right are indifferent. So they don't prefer the 60 to 1 to the 1,000 to 1, but what's important is they don't prefer the 1,000 to 1 to the 60 to 1. So what you have as a retailer, when you show this kind of information, what we hope is you're not alienating any of your customers, and you might be driving some customers to be more loyal or to be more likely to purchase from you. We almost had a retailer willing to do this. So the way that it was going to work was when you were checking out, you could, like, you know, when it's saying preparing your cart or something like that, we were going to flash this information quickly so you could see, and flash their competitors' information. The company we're working with, of course, looked much better than the competitor, or they probably would not have shown it. And then we could see, you know, what does that do then? Do you change your basket? Do you buy more? Are you more likely to sign up for the newsletter? We had everything ready to go. The marketing team was all excited. And at the last minute, they said, we need to run this by our legal department. And then that was the end of that project forever. They said, there's no way you're disclosing this information voluntarily to anybody. So the project was killed. If you know a company that's willing to do it and their legal department will not kill it, please send me an email. Okay, so what this led to as we started to do this research was thinking about other types of inequality within companies and whether people would care about those as well. So in that project, the idea was CEO versus average worker. But the other kind of inequality within companies that's been obviously so salient is the gender pay gap. Most companies have a gender pay gap of, you know, between 20% and, you know, way larger percents. Again, you could say, oh, you know, consumers shouldn't care about that because companies can do whatever they want with their employees. All I should care about is the products and services. Once again, we thought maybe customers would care a little bit about what companies are doing with their employees internally as well. So we ran a field experiment where we had people search for, in this case, we do it with lots of companies, but we used Uber in this case. So we have you search for Uber, and then we feed you back some articles about Uber. And what you can see is sometimes we feed you just random stuff, but if you are getting our pay ratio treatment, we'll say things like female Uber drivers earn less per hour, or you can see at the bottom the gender pay gap applies to Uber as well. And then we ask people, so compared to people who didn't see anything about the gender pay gap, are people who saw this more likely to be against Uber, more likely to switch to a different ride service? We weren't trying to single out Uber in particular. The ratio isn't necessarily worse than lots of other companies, but it's nice to have a very specific decision where it's, do I take that ride or do I take that ride? Obviously, we did this pre-pandemic when, of course, things would be quite different now. So what do we find? First, we find that this information does shift people's preferences. So on average, people move away from Uber when they learn that Uber has this kind of pay discrepancy within the company. We also find that the effect is more pronounced for women than for men. So men show the effect. So when men learn about this pay gap, they move away from Uber and toward other companies. But women show the effect even more. And one of the reasons they show that effect is because they are seeing what's happening inside the company as even more unfair than men are. Everyone agrees that it's not quite fair that the gaps are this big, but women seem to respond even more in this particular case, likely because it affects them directly and it affects men not quite as much in the same visceral way. This study, again, what we're trying to do is show that people will move from a preference to another preference when retailers can disclose that, in fact, what they're doing is good things with their ratios, and they're trying to be equitable with all of their employees, regardless of things like their gender or ethnicity. These projects led actually to a collaboration with the government in the UK, again led by Bhavya Mohan, where the UK also passed a law saying that companies now have to announce their pay gaps and post them on a website. And so this is just a sample report of one company. I don't mean to single any one company out ever in these examples. This is just a sample screen. What we did with them was we played a bit with how we presented the inequality information. So you can see, you could say something like the hourly rate is 2.2% lower than men's. You could frame it as men's is higher than women's. You could show a ratio. You can do all kinds of different things to show specifically this information. And again, you might say, well, that shouldn't matter. The information is the information. But of course, we know that people are people, and it turns out to matter a lot how you frame the information. So just as one example, when you show people pay information, it affects them a little bit, not a ton, but a little bit. When you calculate the ratio for them, even when the ratio is very easy to calculate, it has a way bigger impact on their perceptions. So when you see that, one person's making millions and the other one's not making millions, it bothers people typically, and they don't like it, but it doesn't somehow lock it in for them that they're really upset about what this is doing. For some reason, when we show the ratio like 1,000 to 1, even though you could do the math yourself, 1,000 to 1 suddenly makes people think, wow, this is a huge problem, and they react much more strongly to it. So we work not only in the idea that, if you tell people about inequality, they'll change everything they're doing. Of course, that's not how it works. On the marketing end of things, we try to think about, just as with any attribute of a company, we try to think about how to communicate it most effectively and efficiently so that consumers can understand the differences between companies. And then if they care about that attribute, it can influence their purchasing. The one thing I'll say, though, is we do see, again, limitations on this. So with the Uber studies, as just one example, we ask people a series of questions about taking an Uber versus another ride service. And we find that, so if we say the weather is nice, then people say, oh, I definitely won't take Uber, I'll switch. But if we say it's raining and you either can take Uber or you can walk, then suddenly people get less sensitive to the pay ratios within the company and more sensitive to the fact that they need to get a ride. And so they don't have time to, in a sense, worry about inequality because they don't want to get wet while they walk to work. So, and that's to say that, of course, there's limits on what we can change. So it's not that we show people a picture of a pay ratio and everything they ever thought is out the window and now they only focus on that. Of course, just as with any attribute, they have other concerns about the company and about the product. But what we keep trying to show, and we can show again and again, is that it does move people in the same way that other attributes move people about companies, including like discounts and other things that marketing people like to use a lot. Okay, so so far I focused entirely on money, in a sense, inequality in income, inequality in wealth, inequality in pay within companies as well. And again, we do find that these things tend to matter to people. But we wondered whether there were other domains that we might be missing that we should be studying that are, again, inequality is a central issue, but it might feel differently than just making dollar and cents estimates. And what we came to actually was the idea of health and healthcare. The original idea actually was to think about, and I apologize, this is a painful question, but it was one we asked. So if you say, what percent of the wealth should the top 20% have? I can give you a number. And if you say what percent should the bottom 20% have, again, I can give you a number. And I can give you different numbers there because it feels okay to give different numbers. The question that we had in mind was, of all the babies that die every year, what percent should come from the top 20% and what percent should come from the bottom 20%? It's the same exact question. It's a resource that you could distribute just like wealth. And yet we had the very strong intuition that when we frame it like that, suddenly people will say equal, that's not a thing that we can distribute differently. And of course, the problem is that wealth and income are very correlated with health outcomes. So we have a case where people say they're okay with inequality of some resources, but not okay with inequality of other resources, even though those are linked. We're working on that now as well to see how we can change people's general beliefs about inequality. But I want to just show you one last piece of data. This is a survey that we did. This is again with Saurabh Pongsan, who's actually an MD and then got a PhD in decision making. So he's particularly interested in inequality within the healthcare domain. So the way that this works is we ask people, this is just one of the health domains, but we can literally ask people how they think death and life should be distributed. So there's, we found a very nicely conducted paper that basically showed that over a 20-year period, the average life expectancy increased by 3.2 months. That was just sort of a fact, but that's average across all Americans. So what we can do here is the same thing as before, which we can ask people, what do you think the distribution looked like across income groups? You can see at the bottom, again, we have the poorest 20% up to the richest 20%. And in this case, you can drag these around. So the average has to stay at 3.2 because that's the fact. But where do you think things should actually be moved to? You can play with it a little bit and see if you can get accurate. And of course, you can just leave it like that and say, I think each group got exactly 3.2 months of extra life over this time period. We also, of course, ask people, what do you think it should look like as well? And I'll show you these numbers in a second. So first, just to orient you, we're going to have on the y-axis months of life, basically. So the idea is it was 3.2 on average. What do you think people got more or less of, and which groups do you think that happened to? But I'll show you first the actual distribution over this time period from this other research. And it's very disturbing. So what you can see is that it's not just that the distribution is unequal, but it's that the poorest 20% over this time period were living even shorter than they were before. And in the United States, we've continued to see dynamics like this, where life expectancy is, it's not just it's rising, but rising more quickly for some people. It's that it's actually decreasing for some people while it increases for others. This is sort of dramatic. Literally, you get to live longer based on your income. Again, it may be due to people's decisions and all sorts of other things in their lives, and we can delve into those issues, of course, but the fact of the matter is that this is what the actual distribution looks like. We ask people, remember, what do you think the distribution looks like? And they tell us they think it looks like this. So again, people are not foolish. They understand that there's inequality in the distribution of resources, even like things like life and death. But they do have the theory that probably everyone is living longer. It's just that maybe rich people are living even longer than relative to poor people. Then we ask them, as I said, what do you think it should be? And what you see here is it's extremely flat. It's not perfectly flat, but compared to wealth, where we still had some big differences in who gets what, here we see people are much less comfortable with any sort of inequality in terms of who gets more life. The inequality that we do see typically when we ask people, why did you construct the distribution that way? Typically what they tell us is they believe that personal choices are important. So they believe that people in lower income groups, for example, make worse choices than people in higher income groups, and therefore people in lower income groups don't deserve as much life as wealthier people. We could debate the ethics of that for an entire day, but that's what the data tell us people have in mind. But remember, I told you that we very rarely see with wealth or income that everyone gives the same answer, that everyone should have the same amount of the resource. Here we see dramatically many people say everyone should have the exact same amount. So this good or resource of health and life is treated very differently than these other resources that are more monetary. And as I said, this is problematic because they're very highly correlated with each other. You can't have extreme wealth inequality and somehow also have perfectly equal health outcomes for all people. Even with a great social safety net, even with all sorts of other things in place, it's very unlikely that extreme financial inequality would result in the equal health outcomes. And what we're doing now, as I mentioned, is we're trying to show people their preferences for health outcomes and then ask them their preferences about things like income and wealth distributions. The idea there is that when you focused me on something that I really think should be equal or changed, then does that carry over to other resources? And now I start to think differently about how I feel about those. That gets us we're still very far, but it gets us a little bit closer back to the very beginning of the desert island idea, right? Where it's not just that you get a currency like money and you decide how to distribute it. It's that there are all of these resources that we could distribute among people, and we have to try to trade off among them and figure out across all of the resources which ones are the ones that we think should be traded off equally or distributed differently, and which ones do we say actually the way that is perfectly fine right now. So I'm at time, so thank you again for inviting me. I'm excited to take your questions and see what you have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Norton, for your fantastic presentation. I now have a few questions. We still have some 15 minutes, so let's try to make it as short as possible within the answers. The first question that I've got for you is, your research reveals that citizens and consumers feel that current levels of inequality are too high. What do you see as possible steps that a consumer could give to foster less inequality?
That's a great question. So I mentioned that we were trying to get retailers to put stickers on things, or put on their website that this was their pay ratio and things like that, so that as consumers we could respond to that information if we chose and incorporate that into our purchase decisions. Currently, the information's hidden, so it's very difficult to find out about different companies what the pay ratios are, but they're not entirely hidden. So we can actually, as consumers, find out what different companies are doing. And you see it in the media occasionally that they find a company that has a terrible ratio, and that's like a news story for a little while, and everyone hates that company for a couple of weeks, and then we kind of forget about it and move back to whatever we were doing before. I think our goal is to get people to really think about inequality as a key driver of their decision making, so that when you are buying, you're thinking not just about the thread count of the sheets, but you're also thinking about, does this company internally do things that reflect my values? And we've seen this before, so you can think about ethical supply chains as being a case where consumers did become responsive to that sort of information and did incorporate it into their decision making, provided that it's really like salient at the point of sale, because we're so distracted by so many things. So our stretch goal is to have this information available for all companies, so that if people want, they can incorporate it into their spending decisions.
How can corporations genuinely involve themselves in promoting equality?
This is a tricky one. So you can think about internally or externally as well. We at Harvard Business School, we like to write case studies of companies. That's kind of one of our things that we love to do. I wrote a case study a few years ago on a guy that was called the $70,000 CEO. So he was running a company out in Seattle. His name's Dan Price. He was making a pretty good amount of money, and his employees were making less, of course. And he read about research on money and happiness, and how, if you don't have a lot of money, you're not very happy, and you don't need that much money to be happy. And he decided that what he would do is he would just level everyone's salary at $70,000 a year, which means he took a huge pay cut, and his employees, most of them, got a big raise. So that's like direct action to say, we are going to change how we're dealing with inequality. What's so interesting is that what happened next is much more complicated. So they did, in fact, get more business. So he got a lot of press as this person who's doing this very interesting thing. And lots of people, it was a B2B thing. So lots of companies all over the country in the US would call and say, we want to be your customer. So it actually drove new business into the company as a result of this announcement. That's the good thing. The bad thing is it's not clear completely that it's sustainable, that you can carry on with that pay scheme forever. And in fact, one of the things that we saw when we looked at the company is that some employees who weren't making very much money, and now they felt a lot of pressure to live up to that, and they had more job stress. And some employees who were making, let's say, $70,000, who'd been there for 10 years, now these people who'd worked there for a year were making $70,000, and these people were angry because they said they don't deserve $70,000. I worked a decade to get to this salary level, and some of them left the company. So there isn't which is all to say, there isn't an easy, the thing that companies can do is change this aspect, and then it will have these positive consequences. These are such fundamental shifts within companies that we're not sure yet what happens when companies make bold moves to try to address inequality in society.
Mm-hmm. Third question. Within some corporations, CEO to worker salaries can be as high as 7-to-1. On the one hand, to attract the best talent, corporations need to offer competitive salaries, but on the other, salary differences promote inequality. So here's the question: how do you think this trade-off could be solved by corporations themselves?
Yeah, this is a key aspect to pay differentials in general, which is there's a very strong theory that when there is pay inequality, it motivates people making less to work harder or work differently to get up to the higher level. There's some evidence that that's true, but there's not as much evidence of that as we might hope. So it isn't as though there's 1,000 research studies that show that when there's pay inequity, what happens is people at the bottom work harder to get up to the top. If that were the case, we would think, if we knew that as a fact, we might think very differently about pay inequality within companies. What we do see is that when people find out about pay inequality, it can have really negative consequences. So there's a study actually at University of California at Berkeley, it's from a few years ago, where those salaries are public because that's a public university, so you can look them up online. And what they did is a very simple treatment. They just sent half of employees there information about where they stood in the distribution of pay, and the other half didn't get it. And what they found was if you were above the median of pay, it didn't do much for you. It didn't actually make you happier to know you were learning more. It just didn't really do that much. But if you were below, they found a huge hit on unhappiness. So when you find out that other people are making more than you, it has a dramatic impact on your own happiness. And we know that your own happiness at work plays out in all sorts of ways in the quality of work and in the loyalty to the company and all sorts of other metrics. So to the extent that companies don't publicize these things, it can be okay internally, but typically people find out, especially with new websites where you can see what pay is across companies. And then you have to think about it not just as a, can we keep this secret, but what should the levels be so that people feel they're earning a decent wage, but also still hopefully feel that motivation to keep working hard to try to get up to the top.
Fourth question, how would you suggest brands to involve the topic of inequality in their communication towards consumers?
One of the other areas of research that we do is on charitable giving, and in particular when companies try to engage in corporate social responsibility and contribute to charities and then sort of tell their customers that they're doing that. What we often find is that what companies will do is they'll give some money to charity and then they'll say to their customers, we are nice. And then the idea is that customers will then say, oh, they're nice, why don't we go buy more stuff from them? But the other one is if you buy this product, 10% of proceeds will go to this charity that we picked. Again, it's nice that companies are doing nice things, but from the consumer perspective, think about if someone says, if you buy something, we'll give some of the money to a charity. You're making a niceness contingent. So it'd be like if I asked you, can you help me move? And you said, yes, but only if you help me move first. It's still good, we both can get our stuff moved, but it doesn't feel like a genuine signal that you care. So when some of the things that companies do, like 10% goes to something, can backfire because they don't feel like a genuine signal that the company cares actually about that issue. And we haven't done that style of research yet in the domain of inequality, but some of the very same dynamics are very likely to be there, that if you keep telling people over and over again that you're nice, you get very suspicious. Like if someone in your life tells you all the time they're very nice, you start to wonder, why are they telling me this information? Maybe they're not nice. Companies telling can again make us very suspicious. And another line of research led by Ryan Buell, my colleague at Harvard Business School, we look at transparency. So if you show people what you're doing for them, or you show them the way that inequality happens within the company, that's much more compelling and trustworthy than continuing to just tell people. So we're working now on really thinking about how do we show inequality in a way that feels genuine so that I would resonate with me as a consumer and I might then change my feelings toward that company.
Relations with other variables like a country's GDP or cultural factors?
I missed the first part of the question. How do the preferences?
Did you also test for correlations with other variables like countries' GDP or cultural factors? That's a question from Mr. Setan Eravci.
Great, great question. So when I show the big circles with all the countries on them, and I just quickly summarize with red and blue, I'm leaving out huge other differences between and among all of those countries for sure. We do see, so for example, if you think your country has inequality in pay, that is correlated with the actual level of inequality. So people actually are sort of calibrated. They don't know how unequal it is, but they do know that they're in a country where the inequality looks more like this or more like that. So we do see that those local factors do predict people's feelings about what's going on. A little bit, they predict their ideals. So again, just like with wealth, where you might think that rich and poor people feel very differently, and we don't find that, we again find that from country to country, it's true that countries with, for example, different political systems feel differently about inequality, but we don't tend to see that those differences overwhelm the consensus that we would like things to be more equal than we think they are, which again is already more equal than things actually are.
Next one, and this question is from our viewer Christiana. Do you think the United Kingdom government law on gender equality, pay, transparency should be applied to other countries, namely US companies?
So we would love to see in general more transparency within companies. So we look at transparency in companies for all the things that they're doing. So we know that when, just like with ourselves, when we're left to our own devices, we can take shortcuts and we do all sorts of things that maybe later on we regret doing. I think that companies, in this, just like other humans, in the same way, when they can keep things private is when things can go off the rails a little bit. And so we do want companies to be much more transparent in what they're doing for their customers. And I would like to see, I mean, the dream of those stickers on the product, it's probably never going to happen, but that idea really is that companies are mandated to tell you, here's how we treat our employees. And again, consumers can say, I don't care, and buy whatever they were going to buy. But other consumers might say, thank you for giving me that information. That's actually important to me. And now I'm going to shift from brand A over to brand B.
Mr. Norton, thank you so much for having been with us and giving your insight on all these issues. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.